In the sultry, shadowed streets of Charleston in 1843, whispers traveled faster than the river breeze. They spoke of a man unlike any other, a slave whose sheer presence sent shivers down the spines of the city's most hardened traders. He was said to be dangerous, too wild, too cunning, too unbreakable for the chains meant to contain him. Buyers feared him, yet the highest bidders were drawn to him, compelled by a mix of greed, fascination, and terror. What made this man so perilous that even those accustomed to cruelty hesitated before crossing him? What secrets lay behind the eyes of the most dangerous male slave ever sold in Charleston? This was no ordinary transaction. It was a story of defiance, survival, and a mystery that would haunt the minds of all who encountered him. The man's reputation for unmatched strength and intelligence was whispered in every corner of Charleston, a city where rumors traveled faster than the river currents and where the fear of a single individual could unsettle entire households. From the moment he arrived on the auction block, those who looked upon him sensed there was something different, something unsettling in the way he carried himself, in the measured way he observed the crowd, and in the calm, steady intensity that radiated from his eye. Unlike many others who had been sold, whose fear or resignation was evident in their posture, he stood tall and unwavering, as if nothing in the world could diminish his presence or shake his resolve. There was a power in him that was not purely physical, though it was undeniable that his body alone marked him as extraordinary. His muscles were taut, honed not merely through forced labor but through a natural, almost predatory grace that spoke of a man who was both predator and survivor, a combination that unnerved the most seasoned traders and plantation owners alike. Observers commented not just on his size or strength but on the way he seemed to think, to calculate, to anticipate. While others around him shifted nervously, uncertain of what was expected, he surveyed the room with a clarity that suggested he understood far more than anyone could guess. He could sense the fear in the wealthy buyers, the tension in the auctioneers, and the hidden anxieties that ran beneath polite conversation. There were stories, some exaggerated, some entirely true, that he had been able to lift weights that others twice his size could not, that he had resisted punishments and escapes alike, and that his mind was as sharp as his reflexes. People said he could solve problems, navigate dangerous situations, and manipulate circumstances in ways that made him unpredictable and terrifying to those who sought to own him. Even among other enslaved men, he was a figure of awe and caution. Some whispered that he had been a leader among his peers, not merely because of his strength but because of the cunning he displayed in orchestrating small acts of rebellion, or in guiding others through the harsh realities of plantation life. His intelligence was not the kind that could be measured with books or formal schooling, but a raw, instinctive brilliance that allowed him to read people, situations, and threats with an uncanny accuracy. Plantation overseers complained that no whip, no punishment, no threats could break him in the way they had broken countless others. Some claimed he would stare them down, meeting their gaze without fear, and that the sheer force of his will seemed to make the men in charge second-guess themselves, reconsidering even the smallest actions around him. The combination of his physical prowess and his mental acuity made him a figure of fascination and fear. Stories spread quickly in Charleston, growing with every retelling, painting him as a man who was almost mythic in his capability. They said he could lift objects that seemed impossible for one man to move, that he could run faster than trained dogs, and that his reflexes were so precise that he could evade capture or harm with an almost supernatural agility. But what frightened people most was not just his strength, it was the intelligence that guided it, the strategy and foresight that made him more than just muscle. To have someone so capable in body and mind was dangerous, not only because of what he might do but because no one could predict exactly what he would do. Those who had witnessed him work described a presence that could dominate a space without a word, a silence that carried authority and danger. Even in situations where he was restrained, where chains or shackles attempted to impose control, there was an undeniable energy in him that seemed to vibrate, to radiate, warning anyone who approached that he was not to be underestimated. Traders often argued among themselves, debating whether it was possible to own such a man, or if attempting to do so would be nothing short of inviting disaster. Every purchase was a risk, and every glance at him seemed to carry a reminder that his strength was matched by a cunning that had been honed through years of necessity, instinct, and survival in a brutal world. There were tales that added layers to his legend, stories whispered in dark corners or passed along in hushed tones among those who had seen him in action. Some recounted how he had resisted capture during failed escapes, evading those sent to retrieve him with a mixture of strategy and raw force that seemed impossible to counter. Others claimed that he had subtly manipulated situations to his advantage, outsmarting overseers, exploiting weaknesses, and turning moments of vulnerability into opportunities for survival. Even the most hardened traders admitted that the more they tried to understand him, the more elusive he seemed, like a shadow that could not be pinned down, a storm that could not be contained. It was not just physical confrontations that defined him. His mind worked in ways that left observers unsettled. He seemed to understand human behavior instinctively, to predict decisions before they were made, to navigate the complexities of Charleston's rigid social hierarchy with an almost prescient awareness. This combination of raw power and sharp intellect created a tension that no one in the city had experienced before. He was a challenge to authority, a living test of control, and his very presence raised questions about power, obedience, and fear. To see him standing there, unshaken, unbroken, was to witness a force of nature restrained only by circumstance, and the knowledge that such a force could never truly be tamed haunted those around him. Even when sold at auction, the room seemed to hold its breath. Buyers were not merely bidding for a man, they were gambling with an unpredictable force whose capabilities were spoken of in awe and dread. The air was thick with speculation, as if everyone in the room sensed that what they were about to do was not a simple transaction, but an engagement with something extraordinary. His eyes, calm and calculating, seemed to measure everyone in attendance, and those who met his gaze often felt an uncomfortable awareness that he understood far more than they could imagine. The sense of danger was palpable, a tension that made the atmosphere almost electric, and it was this combination of physical might and mental acuity that earned him a place in Charleston's darkest legend. People would talk about him for decades, long after the auction had ended, long after the city had moved on to other events. His strength became more than just a measure of muscle. It became a symbol of defiance, of the unpredictability of human spirit, and of the way intelligence could amplify power in ways that no one dared to challenge directly. His legend grew because it was rooted in reality, a reality so extraordinary that it seemed almost impossible to comprehend. Even those who never saw him personally knew of the man whose body and mind made him untouchable in ways that terrified and fascinated all who crossed paths with him. The extraordinary combination of his physical abilities and his intelligence left an indelible mark on Charleston's collective memory. It was a warning, a fascination, and a story of survival that no one could ignore. Traders, plantation owners, enslaved individuals, and townspeople alike spoke of him in hushed tones, aware that the presence of someone so capable, so aware, and so dangerous could alter the course of events in ways they might never fully understand. Every tale added to his mystique, every retelling emphasized his unmatched abilities, and every mention underscored the fact that he was not an ordinary man. Rumors of his repeated escapes had already begun to swirl through Charleston long before he appeared on the auction block, painting a portrait of a man who was impossible to contain. These stories traveled from plantation to plantation, whispered from one enslaved person to another, passed along by traders and overseers alike, each retelling adding layers of exaggeration, awe. Some claimed that he had vanished in the dead of night, slipping through the most tightly secured fences and guards, leaving behind nothing but the faintest trace of his presence. Others insisted that he had outsmarted hunting dogs, slipping into marshes and swamps that even the most experienced trackers dared not enter, using the land itself as an ally against those who sought to capture. Each tale painted a picture of a man whose cunning and resourcefulness were as formidable as his physical strength, a man who understood the rules of pursuit better than anyone else, and who manipulated every situation to his advantage. Every escape he attempted seemed to defy law. Accounts described him moving silently through forests, navigating rivers and creeks, and using the terrain with an instinctive knowledge that left his pursuers baffled. There were stories of overseers arriving at the site of his last known labor only to find him gone, as if the very air had swallowed him whole. Sometimes when he was finally caught, it was not through brute force but through elaborate trickery or unforeseen circumstances, a combination of chance and luck that no one could control. People spoke of the way he studied his captors, noting their habits, their routines, and their weaknesses, turning their own methods of control against them in ways that were subtle but undeniably effective. The audacity of his escapes made him legendary among those who had been forced to witness them. Some claimed that he had a network of secret allies among other enslaved people, individuals who understood his methods and helped him move unseen. Others suggested that he relied purely on his own ingenuity, that his mind was a labyrinth of tactics and strategies designed to stay one step ahead of those who tried to confine him. Whether aided by others or relying solely on himself, the results were the same. He could vanish, reappear, and confound even the most disciplined and experienced hunter. This pattern of elusiveness elevated him from a mere man to something closer to a force of nature in the minds of those who recounted his deeds, a being who could not be predicted, measured, or controlled. The fear his escapes instilled was palpable. Plantation owners, many of whom had dealt with difficult slaves before, admitted that he was different. He did not merely run, he challenged the very notion of control, undermining the systems that sought to dominate him. Each time he returned, he did so on his own terms, unbroken and unrepentant, leaving a clear message that his spirit could not be tamed. Traders fretted over the possibility of purchasing someone whose history included repeated acts of defiance, wondering whether he could ever be truly owned or whether attempting to do so would result in ruin. The combination of his past and his reputation made him both irresistible and terrifying to those who hungered for profit, as if they were drawn to danger itself. Every escape added to the mystery of his origins and intention. Some speculated that he had been trained in secret, that his youth had been spent learning the ways of stealth and strategy that enabled him to evade capture repeatedly. Others whispered of a natural genius, a man born with an instinctive understanding of movement, timing and human behavior that made him almost untouchable. The truth was difficult to discern, and perhaps deliberately so, as he seemed to thrive on the uncertainty surrounding his ability. Traders and buyers alike found themselves both frustrated and fascinated by the enigma, unsure whether his escapes were the product of careful planning, luck, or a combination of both. The nature of his defiance was not limited to physical escape. Each time he returned to the plantation, he carried with him a silent assertion of control, a subtle but unmistakable reminder that he was not merely a victim of circumstance, but an active participant in shaping his destiny. Observers noted that his demeanor changed after each attempt, a mix of caution and confidence that suggested he had learned from every failure and succeeded in exploiting every weakness in the system that tried to restrain him. This pattern made him unpredictable, a quality that added to the aura of danger surrounding him. No one could assume that the methods that had worked before would work again, and every interaction with him became a test of wits, strength and patience. Stories of his escapes began to merge with legends of Charleston itself. Traders spoke of him in reverent tones, passing down tales of nights when he vanished into the mist, leaving guards bewildered and overseers shaken. Enslaved individuals told each other of the man who could slip away like a shadow, who could navigate the dangers of the world outside the plantation gates with a skill that seemed beyond human. Even the townspeople, who may never have seen him in person, had heard the rumors, and those stories became a part of the city's folklore, a warning of what could happen when a man refused to be bound by chains or fear. Every recounting emphasized not just the escapes themselves but the intelligence that made them possible. He did not act recklessly. Each movement was calculated, each decision informed by an acute awareness of environment, human behavior and the limitations of those pursuing him. He seemed to anticipate the actions of others before they happened, a foresight that made capture nearly impossible. Traders and overseers alike admitted privately that the man's ability to evade them was both maddening and terrifying, a skill set that elevated him far above the ordinary, a being who could bend circumstances to his will through sheer cleverness. Even when confined temporarily, there was an unspoken tension in his presence, a sense that he could strike, escape or resist at any moment. The chains, the guards, the walls, they were all temporary obstacles to someone who had already proven capable of vanishing from the most secure environments. Each escape left those around him unsettled, unsure whether he could be trusted, contained or predicted. His reputation grew with every retelling, and the fear he inspired became inseparable from the fascination. His observers struggled to reconcile a man so powerful, so intelligent and so unbreakable with the societal norms that sought to deny him agency and control. Rumors also suggested that his escapes were sometimes accompanied by subtle acts of vengeance, actions designed to leave a mark on those who tried to capture him. Some claimed that he sabotaged equipment, misled trackers or found ways to undermine the authority of those who sought to restrain him. Whether true or embellished, these stories contributed to the perception of him as a dangerous and unpredictable force, a man whose intelligence matched his physicality and whose defiance could not be ignored. Every tale reinforced the idea that owning him was not simply a matter of money, it was a gamble with stakes far higher than mere profit, a confrontation with a mind and body that refused to be subdued. Charleston's slave traders often found themselves in heated debates over whether he could truly be controlled or if he was a lost cause, and these discussions were fueled by fear, fascination and greed. It was one thing to hear the rumors of his strength and cunning, to listen to the stories of his repeated escapes and unmatched intelligence, but it was another entirely to face the reality of owning a man who seemed to defy all attempts at domination. Traders argued late into the night in the dimly lit back rooms of warehouses, weighing the risks of bidding on someone who could not be subdued against the potential prestige and profit of possessing such a formidable individual. They debated the odds, speculated on his temperament, and questioned whether even the most experienced owner could ever hope to bend him to their will. Some traders insisted that he could be controlled, that any man, no matter how clever or strong, could eventually be broken with the right combination of fear, force and cunning. They cited past examples of unruly slaves who had been tamed over time, arguing that patience, discipline and a well-structured environment could bring even the most dangerous individuals into submission. They discussed the techniques they might employ: isolation, constant supervision, the careful application of punishment, designed to wear down both body and spirit. In their minds it was a challenge worth the risk, a puzzle to solve that promised enormous reward for whoever succeeded.
Others, however, were adamant that he was beyond control, a man whose very nature resisted subjugation. They spoke in hushed tones about the stories of his defiance, recounting instances where even the most brutal overseers had been forced to retreat, unable to break his spirit or contain his ability. His intelligence, they argued, made him unpredictable and dangerous in ways that brute force could never address. He did not react instinctively or fearfully. He calculated, he anticipated, and he manipulated. No matter the method of control, there was always the risk that he would turn the situation to his advantage, that he would exploit weaknesses in those attempting to dominate him, and that any attempt at ownership could result in disaster. The tension surrounding his potential sale was palpable in Charleston. Every trader knew the stakes were unusually high. To own such a man could bring wealth and status, a sort of twisted prestige associated with controlling someone of extraordinary capability. Yet the fear of failure loomed even larger. If he could not be controlled, if he resisted, escaped, or caused harm, the consequences could be catastrophic. Stories had already circulated of men who had underestimated him, men who had faced injury, embarrassment, or ruin at the hands of someone they assumed could be owned and controlled. This awareness made negotiations fraught with anxiety, each bidder wary of appearing confident, while secretly doubting their ability to manage him. The debates among the traders were not purely practical, they were also philosophical, wrestling with questions that went beyond money and power. Some questioned whether it was even possible to impose control over a man whose intellect and instinct were so finely tuned. Others speculated on the psychology of submission and defiance, attempting to parse his behavior to predict how he might respond to various methods of coercion. They dissected the rumors, trying to separate fact from exaggeration, all the while knowing that the stories they had heard were terrifyingly plausible. The very act of discussion revealed their unease. They were confronting a man who challenged not just their authority, but their assumptions about human capability and obedience. Buyers who had witnessed him firsthand added another layer to the debate. They described his calm, measured presence on the auction block, the way he observed every movement, every expression, and seemed to calculate the intentions of everyone around him. To some, this was evidence of his intelligence and potential threat. To others, it was proof that he could be molded, carefully guided into submission if handled with skill. Each account was dissected and debated, each nuance scrutinized for clues about how he might behave once purchased. Even small details, the way he shifted his weight, the steadiness of his gaze, the controlled way he spoke, were analyzed for meaning, as if understanding these subtleties might reveal the secret to mastery over him. The very uncertainty of his nature made him both dangerous and desirable. Traders and buyers alike were drawn to the challenge, fascinated by the possibility of acquiring a man who had earned a reputation for being uncontrollable, yet the fear that accompanied him was never far from their mind. Even seasoned men, accustomed to owning and managing the strongest or most cunning slaves, admitted privately that they were intimidated by the notion of possessing someone who could resist so thoroughly, someone whose capabilities seemed to transcend ordinary limits. The combination of physical power and mental acuity made him an anomaly, a man whose very existence disrupted the usual calculations of risk and reward. Negotiations for his sale were tense and deliberate. Bidders measured each other, gauging courage, appetite for risk, and understanding of what they were truly engaging with. It was not simply about money, it was a test of nerve. Who would dare to claim him, to assume the responsibility of controlling someone whose past had already proven that standard methods were insufficient? The room was thick with anticipation, the air charged with anxiety and speculation, as each potential buyer weighed the consequences of failure against the lure of prestige and power. The auction itself became a microcosm of the broader debates about control, defiance, and human will, a stage on which the extraordinary nature of this man could be fully acknowledged. Even after the sale, the debates did not end. Buyers and traders continued to discuss his potential, speculating on how he might behave under different conditions and who, if anyone, could manage him successfully. Stories of his previous resistance were shared repeatedly, analyzed and interpreted, each retelling reinforcing the idea that he was unlike anyone else. Some predicted disaster for whoever bought him, while others imagined that careful handling might yield a remarkable prize. A man who could perform incredible labor, possess remarkable skills, and yet remain aware and calculating in a way that would make him invaluable. The uncertainty surrounding him became part of his legend, a defining characteristic that ensured he would be remembered long after the auction concluded. Charleston itself seemed to hold its breath, as if the city understood that what was happening was not merely a transaction but an encounter with a being whose very existence challenged the established order. Traders argued, buyers hesitated, and the stories of his defiance, cunning, and power grew with each telling, solidifying his reputation as someone who could not easily be dominated, controlled, or predicted. The debates were endless, reflecting both fear and admiration, a recognition that this was a man whose capabilities demanded respect, caution and careful consideration.
He was known to instill fear in both slaves and masters alike, and that fear was not the fleeting, superficial kind that arose from a single display of strength or aggression. It was deeper, more pervasive, rooted in the combination of his physical presence, his sharp intellect, and an almost instinctual understanding of human behavior. The enslaved men and women who labored alongside him felt a mixture of awe and caution, recognizing that he could protect, intimidate, or manipulate situations in ways that none of them could. They observed the way he moved, the way he spoke, and the way he surveyed every corner of the plantation, noting even the smallest irregularity. His awareness was constant, and that awareness gave him an authority that was felt without a word, a silent command that everyone around him recognized and, whether consciously or unconsciously, obeyed. For the masters, the fear was different but no less real. Plantation overseers, accustomed to controlling and punishing countless enslaved individuals, found themselves unsettled in his presence. Even men who prided themselves on their harshness admitted privately that there was something about him that could not be dominated by fear alone. They observed how he responded to threats, how he measured the reactions of those who approached him, and how he seemed to anticipate the actions of others before they occurred. There was a tension in every interaction, a subtle understanding that he could exploit weaknesses, turn situations to his advantage, or defy orders with consequences that could not always be predicted. The fear he inspired was a recognition of his potential, an acknowledgement that he was not like others who had been enslaved before him, and that underestimating him could be disastrous. Among the other enslaved people, his presence was a double-edged sword. Some admired him, saw him as a figure of power and potential resistance, someone who embodied the hope that the human spirit could remain unbroken even in the harshest conditions. Others feared him, wary of the attention his strength and intelligence drew, concerned that any misstep near him could lead to punishment, suspicion, or harm. They watched him carefully, noting his moods, his movements, and his interactions, trying to predict what he might do next. To be near him was to exist in a heightened state of awareness, a constant negotiation between respect, caution, and survival, and this dynamic made him a central figure in the social environment of the plantation. His reputation for instilling fear extended beyond personal encounters to the stories told about him. Tales of his exploits, his cunning, and his ability to defy control spread quickly, growing in intensity with each retelling. Some described incidents in which he had thwarted overseers' attempts to punish him, using his intelligence and strength to escape or turn the tables. Others spoke of moments when his presence alone prevented potential acts of cruelty, as if his very being imposed a check on those who might otherwise have acted without restraint. The fear he inspired was not just about what he could do physically, it was about the recognition that he was always thinking, always calculating, always aware, and that this awareness made him unpredictable, dangerous, and formidable. Masters and overseers often tried to rationalize the fear he inspired, framing it as a challenge to be overcome rather than a sign of genuine respect or apprehension. They devised strategies, consulted each other, and debated methods to assert control. Yet the more they planned, the more they realized the difficulty of containing someone so perceptive. Their confidence waned as they acknowledged, sometimes grudgingly, that his abilities, both physical and mental, placed him in a category entirely separate from the ordinary enslaved population. He was a problem that could not be solved with traditional methods, a force whose unpredictability demanded constant vigilance and careful management. Even the community beyond the plantation felt the ripple effects of his presence. Neighbors, traders, and townspeople who caught glimpses of him or heard the stories shared a mixture of fascination and apprehension. The reputation he had earned through his actions and escapes made him a figure that could not be ignored. People speculated about his past, his abilities, and what might happen if he ever fully tested the limits of the control imposed upon him. The fear he inspired became a part of his identity, inseparable from his strength and intelligence, and it created a sense of tension that lingered in Charleston long after he left any given location. His mannerisms contributed to the fear he inspired. There was a precision in the way he moved, a calm deliberation in his speech, and a piercing intensity in his gaze that suggested he was always in control, always assessing, always ready. He did not need to raise his voice, or act violently to command attention. His presence alone was enough. The subtlety of his intimidation made him even more formidable, as it was difficult to predict when or if he might act. Those around him learned quickly that underestimating him could be catastrophic, and that respect or fear was the only way to navigate interactions with him safely. The stories of fear were amplified by the mysterious aura that surrounded him. Little was known of his past, and what was known was filtered through exaggeration, rumor, and speculation. People imagined scenarios, filled in gaps with their worst fears, and assumed the worst about his capability. Each retelling added to the perception that he was not just strong or intelligent, but dangerous in ways that could not be measured or anticipated. This aura became part of his identity, a psychological weapon that extended beyond physical confrontations, making even the most confident individuals pause and reconsider their assumptions. Even during moments of labor or interaction, there was a tension that could be felt by all. Overseers would approach him with caution, slaves would watch him from a distance, and neighbors or traders would observe him with a mixture of curiosity and unease. The fear he instilled was constant, pervasive, and multifaceted. It was physical, intellectual, and psychological all at once. He had the power to act, the intelligence to manipulate, and the presence to command attention without saying a word. In every environment, he altered the dynamics of those around him simply by existing within it. In essence, the fear he inspired was a reflection of his singularity. He was not simply another enslaved man. He was an extraordinary individual whose combination of strength, intelligence, and instinctive understanding of human behavior made him unpredictable, uncontainable, and formidable. This fear served multiple purposes. It protected him, it warned others, and it amplified his legend. Stories of his capacity to intimidate both peers and masters spread far and wide, becoming part of the folklore of Charleston and contributing to a reputation that would endure long after the immediate circumstances of his life had passed. Some whispered that he had a secret past no one could uncover, a history shrouded in mystery and speculation, that only added to the aura of danger and fascination surrounding him. Charleston had long been a city where rumors spread like wildfire, and his story, fragmentary and enigmatic as it was, became a magnet for conjecture. People wondered where he had come from, what experiences had shaped him, and why he was unlike any other man they had ever encountered. The fact that no one could trace his origins with certainty created an air of the unknown, and the unknown in a city already steeped in tension and fear was always the most terrifying element of all. He arrived in Charleston as a figure almost larger than life, and yet beyond the obvious physicality and strength, there was something intangible about him. Observers could not help but notice a depth in his gaze, a reflective intelligence that seemed to hint at experiences no one had witnessed. Some speculated that he had been trained in secret, perhaps in faraway lands or under circumstances so severe that only the toughest, most cunning men could survive. Others whispered darker theories that he had survived brutal events, had been shaped by trauma, and emerged not broken but sharpened, his mind and body honed into instruments of survival. The uncertainty of his past made him unpredictable, and the unpredictable is always dangerous. Among traders and plantation owners, speculation ran rampant. Some believed he might have been involved in previous uprisings, though there was no proof, only whispers carried by word of mouth. Others imagined a life in which he had escaped before, wandered through forests and swamps, encountered dangers that no ordinary man could endure, and survived by sheer cunning and strength. Every element of conjecture served to enhance the perception of him as someone whose capabilities were beyond ordinary comprehension. The fear he inspired was magnified by the mystery of what he had endured, and the possibilities of what he might be capable of doing. Even among the enslaved population, his unknown past created both admiration and caution. Many looked at him as someone who carried knowledge, wisdom, and resilience that could only have been gained through extraordinary circumstance. They speculated in hushed tones about what he had seen, what he had survived, and how he had come to be the man who now stood among them. The uncertainty surrounding his history made him an enigma, a figure who could inspire hope, fear, or both depending on who observed him. The stories of his previous life, true, exaggerated, or entirely fabricated, became inseparable from the man himself, creating a reputation that no physical demonstration of power could fully explain. Traders debated furiously over what his past meant for his potential as a purchaser. Some argued that a man with such a mysterious history could be incredibly valuable if properly controlled, that his experiences had given him skills and resilience that could be harnessed. Others countered that the unknown was too dangerous, that a man who had survived untraceable adventures, who had perhaps learned lessons in cunning, strength, and rebellion beyond comprehension, could never be fully restrained. They worried that the past could carry behaviors, instincts, and knowledge that would make him unmanageable, even lethal if provoked. The very fact that no one could know his history made the stakes of ownership higher than anything they had faced before. Speculation extended into the most fantastical and improbable theories. Some believed he might have been trained as a soldier or a warrior in distant lands, possessing skills in strategy and combat that no ordinary overseer could match. Others imagined that he had endured unimaginable trials, that he had escaped from circumstances far worse than slavery itself, and had emerged with a combination of cunning, resilience, and calculated aggression that rendered him untouchable. Even though these theories were impossible to verify, the stories themselves contributed to his legend.
creating a perception that the man's abilities were not merely natural, but the result of a life forged in extreme conditions. The secrecy of his past also affected how people treated him in the present. Overseers approached with caution, not knowing which skills, knowledge, or connections he might possess. Other enslaved individuals observed him closely, wondering what experiences had shaped his judgment, his instincts, and his extraordinary ability. The unknown created a psychological edge. People assumed he was capable of more than they could imagine, and the assumption alone influenced their behavior around him. The aura of mystery functioned almost like armor, making him more formidable without a single act of defiance or aggression. In Charleston, rumors about his origins were often embellished for dramatic effect. Each retelling added new layers to the narrative of his past. One story might claim he had escaped from a violent plantation owner in another state, navigating rivers and forests for weeks without being caught. Another might suggest that he had been part of a secret society or a rebel faction, trained in tactics and strategy far beyond the comprehension of ordinary men. These stories, true or false, spread quickly, creating a sense of anticipation and fear that preceded his very presence. People were never quite sure who he was or what he had experienced, and that uncertainty made them cautious, respectful, and wary all at once. The mystery of his past also elevated his reputation as danger. When people cannot understand a person's background, they tend to fill in the gaps with their worst fear. The combination of his strength, intelligence, and unknown history made him seem almost mythic, a man whose capabilities were undefined, whose limits were unknowable, and whose potential for defiance or rebellion could never be accurately predicted. Every rumor added to the perception that he was a man to be feared, respected, and carefully considered before any engagement. Even the auction itself became a stage where his mysterious past played a role. Buyers and observers whispered among themselves, wondering what experiences had shaped the man they were about to purchase. Each potential buyer considered not only the physical and intellectual capacities he demonstrated, but the possibilities implied by the stories of his life before Charleston. Was he merely strong and clever, or had he been tempered by hardships, challenges, and training that would make him nearly impossible to control? The uncertainty made bidding tense, cautious, and deliberate, as each man weighed the potential rewards against the unimaginable risk. Every aspect of his existence, the strength he displayed, the intelligence he wielded, the defiance he had already demonstrated, was inseparable from the mystery of his past. People speculated endlessly, and those speculations became part of the story, part of the aura that surrounded him. They created a sense that he was more than human in certain ways, that he possessed skills and knowledge that could not be fully understood or anticipated. This mystique was as powerful as his physical presence, shaping the way he was perceived, feared, and admired. The unknown history of this man became a tool of psychological influence. People assumed that because they could not know his past, they could not predict his actions. This uncertainty worked to his advantage, giving him leverage in situations where otherwise he might have been constrained by social or physical limitation. His aura of mystery created a constant tension, a sense that anything could happen at any moment, and that awareness alone kept him untouchable, respected, and feared by everyone in his orbit. His auction drew the wealthiest and most daring buyers despite the danger that surrounded him, creating an atmosphere thick with anticipation, fear, and fascination. In Charleston, auctions were already high-stakes events, places where fortunes could be made or ruined within the space of a single sale, but this particular auction carried attention unlike any other. Whispers had already circulated about the man's strength, intelligence, defiance, and mysterious past, and each potential buyer entered the room aware that they were not merely bidding on a slave, they were engaging with a force of nature, a man whose abilities and unpredictability had already earned him a legendary reputation. The very air seemed charged with the expectation of something extraordinary, as if the auction block itself had become a stage for a test of nerve, courage, and perception. The wealthiest buyers, men accustomed to asserting dominance over both people and situations, approached cautious. They had seen countless auctions and had purchased the strongest, most skilled, or most obedient slaves, but this man represented an entirely different kind of risk. His reputation preceded him. Stories of escapes, defiance, intelligence, and mysterious origins had spread throughout the city, coloring every conversation, every glance, and every calculation of potential profit and danger. These men understood that acquiring him was not simply a transaction, it was a gamble with stakes far higher than ordinary. Every dollar bid, every strategy considered, was influenced by the knowledge that the man they sought to purchase could resist, escape, or even retaliate, in ways they could not predict. Some buyers were drawn to the challenge itself. The idea of possessing someone so powerful and intelligent, someone who had repeatedly defied authority and survived impossible circumstances, carried an almost magnetic allure. To control such a man would be the ultimate testament to wealth, cunning, and dominance. a symbol that their authority extended even over the most formidable of human beings. They imagined the prestige that came with success, the sense of superiority that could be derived from proving that even the most dangerous individual could be bent to their will. Yet alongside this fascination there was always the shadow of doubt, a gnawing fear that the man's cunning, strength, and unknown history could turn against them at any moment. Other buyers approached with hesitation, their caution rooted in experience and instinct. They had heard the stories, witnessed glimpses of his abilities, and understood the potential for disaster. A man with his reputation could not be underestimated. Any attempt to assert control could fail, and failure carried consequences that were both material and personal. These buyers calculated risks meticulously, weighing their desire for the extraordinary against the likelihood of loss, injury, or embarrassment. Some withdrew entirely, unwilling to take the chance, while others pressed forward, driven by greed, curiosity, or a desire to prove their courage. The auction became a crucible, separating the bold, the reckless, and the cautious, each man acutely aware that his decision would have ramifications beyond simple financial outcomes. The atmosphere within the auction house reflected the extraordinary nature of them. Conversations were hushed, glances were measured, and the weight of anticipation seemed to press down on everyone present. Observers commented on the subtle tension that emanated from both the crowd and the auctioneer, as if the entire room had collectively recognized that this was no ordinary sale. The man himself, calm and composed, stood in the center of attention, his posture controlled, his gaze steady, and his mind undoubtedly assessing each individual, weighing their intentions and predicting their actions. His presence alone altered the dynamics of the auction, forcing buyers to contend not only with each other but with the reality of the extraordinary individual they sought to acquire. As bidding began, the interplay between fascination and fear became evident. Each offer was made with a mixture of calculation and bravado, as men sought to assert dominance over both their competitors and the man himself. Some bids were aggressive, designed to intimidate others into submission, while others were tentative, reflecting uncertainty about the wisdom of owning someone so dangerous. Every movement, every gesture, every pause was scrutinized by both buyers and the man at the center of the auction, creating a web of observation, strategy, and psychological maneuvering that extended far beyond the typical dynamics of a sale. Stories of his past defiance and escapes were on everyone's mind, influencing every decision. Buyers imagined the possibilities of resistance, rebellion, or manipulation, and the fear of being outsmarted or overpowered loomed large. The man's reputation had effectively transformed the auction from a mere commercial transaction into a theater of risk, strategy, and suspense. Each participant was acutely aware that while money could buy him, it could not guarantee control. This uncertainty heightened the stakes, making every bid both a statement of ambition and a gamble with consequences that no one could fully anticipate. The wealthiest and most daring buyers were also aware that owning him carried social implications. Successfully managing a man of such extraordinary ability would confer a kind of status that was unparalleled. It would demonstrate not only financial power but strategic intelligence and courage. Conversely, failure to assert control, or worse, being publicly humiliated by his defiance, could damage reputations, invite ridicule, and even endanger personal safety. This duality of potential reward and risk created a psychological tension that permeated the auction, making it a unique spectacle in Charleston's history. Observers outside the auction also contributed to the charged atmosphere. Rumors and speculation about the man had already spread, and those who could not participate in the bidding were keenly aware of the drama unfolding. The presence of such a dangerous, intelligent, and unpredictable individual drew attention far beyond the auction house, and the stories of his past exploits only amplified the sense of anticipation. Charleston, a city already steeped in hierarchy, fear, and the unspoken rules of power, seemed to hold its collective breath, as if recognizing that this sale was unlike any other, and that the man at its center was no ordinary human being. Throughout the proceedings, the man remained a figure of calm observation, a silent force whose awareness and intelligence influenced every interaction. Buyers and observers alike were acutely aware that he was not merely passive. He was calculating, observing, and mentally cataloging every movement, gesture, and word. This awareness heightened the tension, making each action in the room fraught with significance, and reinforcing the perception that owning him was not merely a question of money, but of skill, insight, and psychological acumen. His presence turned the auction into a test of nerve and perception, a scenario in which every participant had to navigate not only competition with peers but the potential unpredictability of the man himself. By the time the hammer fell, the auction had become a spectacle of human psychology, fear, and ambition. The man's extraordinary abilities, his mysterious past, and the aura of danger he exuded, had transformed a simple commercial transaction into an event that would be remembered and recounted for years. The wealthiest and most daring buyers had vied not only for the opportunity to possess him but for the challenge of controlling someone who had repeatedly defied expectations and survived circumstances that would have broken others. The auction underscored a reality that no amount of money could fully overcome. The man at its center was exceptional in ways that defied ordinary understanding, and owning him meant engaging with a force that could not be easily subdued.
Stories of his defiance spread along the southern coast with a speed that seemed almost unnatural, carried on whispers, rumors, and first-hand accounts, each retelling amplifying the legend of the man who could not be tamed. From Charleston to the surrounding plantations and towns, his name became synonymous with danger, intelligence, and unyielding spirit. Those who had seen him in person described him in hushed tones, as if speaking too loudly would somehow summon the consequences of his reputation. Travelers and traders passing through communities would repeat the tales they had heard, embellishing the narrative with every step, until the stories painted a picture of a man who was more than human, a figure whose cunning and power seemed to defy the natural order. It was not only his physical strength that made the stories compelling, but the sharpness of his mind and the audacity of his actions. Accounts circulated of how he had resisted punishment, outwitted overseers, and vanished from situations that seemed inescapable. These anecdotes became a source of fascination for some, and terror for others, reinforcing the idea that he was unpredictable and untouchable. People speculated endlessly about the methods he employed, the strategies he devised, and the knowledge he must have acquired to survive repeatedly against such odds. Every successful act of defiance became another thread in a tapestry of legend, a narrative that stretched far beyond the confines of any single plantation or auction house. Enslaved men and women in particular passed these stories among themselves, sometimes with admiration, sometimes with caution, recognizing both the brilliance and the danger embodied in him. They spoke of his ability to navigate threats, to sense danger before it arrived, and to manipulate situations in ways that protected not only himself but at times those around him. The tales of his cunning inspired hope and caution, admiration and fear, creating a complex relationship between him and those who witnessed his action. He became a symbol, a figure whose existence challenged the assumptions of submission and obedience that underpinned the institution of slavery in the South. Merchants, overseers, and plantation owners were equally captivated, though their fascination was tinged with fear. The man's reputation forced them to reconsider long-held notions of control, authority, and human capacity. Stories of his defiance were not merely entertaining, they were warning. Each tale served as a reminder that the human spirit, when combined with intelligence, strength, and audacity, could resist the strictest systems of domination. Traders debated among themselves, recalling incidents where their peers had attempted to assert control and failed, where a miscalculation had led to injury, humiliation, or loss. These narratives reinforced the perception that he was exceptional, a being whose capabilities exceeded ordinary comprehension, and that owning him came with risks that could not be fully anticipated. Rumors about his exploits took on a life of their own as they traveled along the coast. By the time stories reached distant plantations or port towns, the accounts had often become more elaborate, mixing fact with speculation, exaggeration, and myth. One tale might claim that he had escaped from multiple plantations in a single week, leaving a trail of bewildered overseers and frustrated guards behind him. Another might suggest that he had outwitted an entire group of hunters sent specifically to capture him, using the terrain and his keen observation skills to evade every attempt at confinement. Whether true or embellished, these stories contributed to a sense of awe and trepidation, establishing him as a figure whose capabilities could not be ignored or underestimated. The repetition of these stories created an almost psychological impact on those who encountered him. Even indirect people who had never met him personally spoke of him with a mixture of reverence and caution, assuming that if such a man existed, his presence alone could influence events in ways that were unpredictable and potentially dangerous. This collective perception amplified his reputation, creating a feedback loop in which fear, admiration, and speculation reinforced each other. As the stories traveled, so too did the aura of his power, extending his influence far beyond the immediate confines of any physical location. Among the enslaved, his legend served both as inspiration and as a warning. They admired his strength, intelligence, and resourcefulness, recognizing in him the embodiment of qualities that were systematically suppressed and controlled. At the same time, they were cautious, aware that proximity to someone so powerful could draw unwanted attention or provoke conflict. Observing him required constant vigilance, as his presence could shift the balance of authority and influence within the plantation. His defiance became a model, illustrating the possibilities of resistance, but it also underscored the dangers inherent in challenging the established order. Plantation owners, on the other hand, interpreted the stories differently. They were acutely aware that a man with such a reputation could destabilize their operations, influence other enslaved individuals, and potentially incite rebellion or escape attempts. His fame as a figure of defiance made him an unpredictable variable, one that could not be managed by traditional methods of control. Many debated whether acquiring such a man was worth the risk, recognizing that his abilities might enhance labor productivity if successfully subdued, but that failure could result in disaster. The stories spread along the coast became strategic intelligence in their minds, shaping decisions about bidding, ownership and containment. Even outside of plantations, in taverns, markets and docks his legend persisted. Traders and sailors would recount tales of his cunning and strength to one another, embellishing events with each telling. By the time these stories reached distant towns or neighboring states, the man had taken on an almost mythic stature, a force to be reckoned with, a cautionary tale and a source of fascination all at once. The spread of these narratives ensured that his reputation was not localized but rather extended along the southern coast, touching the lives and imaginations of people who would never encounter him directly but were nonetheless affected by the stories of his exploits. The man's defiance also highlighted broader tensions within the system of slavery itself. His repeated escapes, cunning strategies and ability to resist control challenged the assumptions that enslavers held about obedience, predictability and human behavior. Stories of his actions reminded everyone who heard them that the systems designed to subjugate individuals were not infallible, that exceptional individuals could subvert expectations, and that fear, intelligence and resourcefulness could combine to defy even the most oppressive structure. His legend became emblematic of resistance, creating a narrative that transcended his immediate actions and entered into the consciousness of a broader region. Each story of defiance contributed to the psychological power he wielded. People speculated endlessly about his next move, what he might attempt, and how he might challenge authority in the future. The mere anticipation of his actions created a sense of tension and unease, ensuring that his presence or even the thought of it was enough to influence behavior. Traders, overseers, and enslaved individuals alike operated under the shadow of his reputation, making decisions with an awareness of his potential and in doing so reinforcing the man's legendary status. Even after he was sold, the aura of danger surrounding him persisted, following him like a shadow that no chains, walls, or overseers could dispel. Charleston had witnessed the culmination of his auction, yet the stories of his defiance, intelligence, and unmatched skill continued to ripple through the city and surrounding plantations, amplified by whispers, speculation, and first-hand account. Buyers who had risked fortunes to own him now faced the reality of his presence, and the tension in the air was palpable. He carried with him the weight of his past actions, a reputation that had grown with every escape, every act of cunning, and every demonstration of unbroken spirit. The fear he inspired did not dissipate upon the completion of the sale. If anything, it intensified as those who now had responsibility over him realized that ownership was not equivalent to control. Observers remarked on the subtle ways he asserted authority without overt aggression. His movements, measured and deliberate, communicated a sense of awareness that few could match. Overseers noted that he never acted without purpose, and his gaze often seemed to anticipate their intentions before they had been executed. It was as if he had internalized every story of his past, every lesson learned from previous escapes and confrontations, and used that knowledge to navigate the present with unparalleled skill. The awareness he carried with him was not passive, it was a form of power, a constant reminder that he remained an active agent in a world that sought to define and confine him. The auction may have changed the ownership of his body, but it did nothing to diminish the strength of his mind. Every interaction, every task assigned, and every glance exchanged, was imbued with the same calculating intelligence that had made him legendary. Traders, buyers, and plantation overseers who had observed him closely during the auction could now witness firsthand that he had not been tamed by the act of sale. Instead, he moved with an almost imperceptible resistance, testing boundaries, probing weaknesses, and silently asserting his autonomy in ways that were both subtle and profound. The man's presence challenged the assumptions of those around him, forcing them to reconsider what it meant to hold power and how easily it could be undermined. His reputation continued to influence behavior far beyond his immediate environment. Other enslaved individuals watched him closely, learning from his tactics, his demeanor, and the ways he manipulated circumstances to his advantage. Some admired him openly, seeing in his defiance a form of inspiration, a living example of resilience and intelligence that could not be extinguished. Others maintained caution, wary of the consequences that proximity to such a powerful figure could bring. Even those who had no direct contact with him internalized the stories, allowing the aura of his capabilities to shape their expectations, fears, and strategies for survival. The men who had purchased him quickly realized that traditional methods of control were insufficient. Physical strength alone could not dominate a mind so sharp, and harsh punishment failed to break his spirit. Overseers had to rethink their approach entirely, employing constant vigilance, observation, and psychological strategies to anticipate his action. Every movement he made was calculated,
every response measured, and every opportunity seized in ways that left those attempting to control him both frustrated and fearful. The very act of ownership became a delicate negotiation, a test of wits and patience rather than a simple assertion of authority. Word of his new circumstances spread quickly, traveling from plantation to plantation and through the social networks of Charleston and the surrounding area. People speculated endlessly about how he would behave under his new owners, whether he would continue to defy expectations or be broken by the unfamiliar environment. Rumors and anecdotes circulated about minor incidents, tasks he completed in unexpected ways, brief escapes from assigned duties, or subtle manipulations of his environment that demonstrated he had not relinquished control. Each story reinforced the legend, creating a sense of inevitability around the idea that he would continue to challenge authority wherever he went. Even when engaged in labor, his intelligence and defiance were evident. He approached each task with meticulous attention, often completing work efficiently while simultaneously testing the limits of supervision. Overseers found themselves in constant negotiation, attempting to assert control without provoking resistance that could escalate into defiance or escape. The man's presence disrupted the established hierarchy, demonstrating that power could not be assumed simply through ownership or position. His actions reminded everyone around him that autonomy, intelligence and resourcefulness were forces that could not be constrained by physical possession alone. The psychological impact of his presence was profound. Both enslaved individuals and overseers were acutely aware of his capabilities, and this awareness shaped every interaction. He became a figure whose potential actions influenced decisions, strategies and behaviors long before any direct engagement occurred. Fear, respect and caution were inseparable from daily life in his vicinity, creating an environment where anticipation and vigilance became essential for survival and authority. The legend of his defiance, reinforced by real-time demonstrations of intelligence and cunning, ensured that he retained influence far beyond what anyone had anticipated. His ability to manipulate perception was as powerful as his physical strength. He understood how stories of his past had shaped expectations, and he used that knowledge to his advantage. Subtle gestures, calculated pauses, and carefully chosen actions reinforced the aura of unpredictability that had made him so feared. Buyers and overseers found themselves constantly evaluating their assumptions, adjusting strategies and second-guessing their approaches, unable to rely solely on force or intimidation. The psychological interplay created by his presence was a testament to his intellect, a reminder that he had not merely survived but thrived in circumstances designed to suppress him. Over time, his story became part of the cultural fabric of Charleston. Tales of his exploits were recounted in taverns, marketplaces, and homes, blending fact with embellishment to create a figure who was simultaneously human and legendary. The narrative of his defiance transcended individual experience, entering the collective consciousness as a symbol of cunning, strength, and unyielding spirit. Each retelling ensured that his influence extended far beyond his immediate environment, shaping perceptions, expectations, and fears across the city and beyond. Even within the plantation, the dynamic he created continued to challenge traditional hierarchy. Other enslaved individuals adapted their behavior in response to him, learning from his strategies, observing his interactions, and integrating lessons into their own approaches to survival. Overseers adjusted their oversight, becoming more cautious, more attentive, and more strategic in their efforts to maintain authority. The man's presence became a catalyst for change, influencing not only immediate interactions, but also broader patterns of behavior, risk management, and social dynamics within the plantation and surrounding community. The lasting impression he left on Charleston was as much psychological as it was physical. Fear, respect, and anticipation became intertwined, creating a reputation that was virtually impossible to ignore. His continued defiance under new ownership demonstrated that the man was more than the sum of his physical capabilities. He was a force of intellect, strategy, and resilience that challenged the very foundations of the systems that sought to contain him. His legend grew with every interaction, ensuring that the man's impact would be remembered, feared, and admired long after his presence had passed from the immediate environment. Despite being sold to a new owner, he quickly demonstrated that ownership did not equate to obedience, and this revelation sent waves of fear and disbelief through Charleston's social and economic networks. The man who had been described in whispers and rumors as nearly untamable now confronted his new environment with the same calculated defiance that had made him legendary. Those who had believed that a fresh set of hands, stricter discipline, or sheer force could finally subdue him were quickly forced to confront the reality that his reputation was not merely exaggerated but firmly grounded in extraordinary ability. Observers noted the subtle ways he exerted control over situations, manipulating perceptions, testing limits, and asserting his intelligence in ways that undermined conventional methods of domination. His arrival at the new plantation was met with caution, as overseers and workers alike watched his every movement, unsure what to expect. The initial tasks assigned to him were mundane, designed to gauge his reaction and assert the authority of his new owner. Yet even in these early interactions, it became apparent that he approached every directive with deliberate calculation. There was a rhythm to his movements, a careful balance between compliance and assertion, that left overseers both impressed and uneasy. He completed tasks efficiently, yet in ways that subtly challenged the assumptions of control, demonstrating that his mind remained free, even if his body was now in someone else's possession. The other enslaved individuals on the plantation quickly became aware of the extraordinary nature of his presence. Some observed from a distance, curious and cautious, recognizing that proximity to a man of his capabilities carried both opportunity and risk. They noted his interactions, his strategies and his timing, understanding that the lessons embedded in his behavior could be instructive. Others admired him openly, seeing in his intelligence, strength and calculated defiance, a model for navigating the harsh realities of enslavement. The combination of respect, fear, and curiosity created a complex dynamic that reshaped the social environment, giving him a subtle but undeniable influence over both peers and authority figures. Overseers accustomed to controlling enslaved laborers through a combination of supervision and punishment, quickly realized that conventional methods were insufficient. Physical coercion did little to constrain him, and harsh disciplinary measures often backfired, revealing his capacity to anticipate, adapt and respond in ways that undermined authority. Each failed attempt to assert dominance only reinforced the perception of his exceptionalism, heightening both fear and caution. Those tasked with managing him found themselves in a constant state of evaluation, forced to consider psychological strategies alongside physical oversight, aware that even small miscalculations could have consequences far beyond immediate frustration. News of his behavior traveled quickly, reaching neighboring plantations, markets, and social gatherings. Stories of his intelligence, defiance, and adaptability spread with remarkable speed, bolstered by both factual accounts and embellishments that magnified the sense of danger he represented. Traders, planters and overseers who had never seen him in person speculated endlessly about his capabilities, imagining scenarios in which his cunning might outmaneuver authority, evade capture or assert influence in unpredictable ways. Each retelling enhanced the mythology surrounding him, creating a figure whose reputation extended far beyond his physical presence, and whose legend was woven into the collective consciousness of Charleston and its environment. Even routine labor became a stage upon which he demonstrated his strategic mind. Tasks were executed with precision, yet often accompanied by subtle deviations that revealed his awareness and control over his environment. Overseers found themselves scrutinizing every movement, every glance, every pause, trying to anticipate potential resistance or manipulation. The psychological pressure he exerted was as significant as his physical capabilities, reinforcing the understanding that power was not merely about ownership but about the capacity to anticipate, adapt and influence. His presence became a constant variable, reshaping the assumptions and behavior of everyone around him. The interplay between fear and respect was evident in all interaction. Those tasked with overseeing him approached with caution, aware that misjudgment could provoke defiance, escape attempts or even rebellion. Other enslaved individuals navigated proximity to him with similar attentiveness, balancing admiration for his abilities with awareness of potential consequence. The subtle power dynamics he created were complex, reflecting an understanding of human behavior that amplified his influence and underscored the difficulty of asserting control over. His intellect and adaptability transformed ordinary interactions into exercises in strategy and negotiation, elevating every encounter beyond the expectations of those who sought to dominate him. Stories of minor acts of defiance spread quickly, reinforcing his reputation and creating an aura of unpredictability. Even small gestures, deliberate pauses, calculated delays, or clever manipulations of routine were interpreted as evidence of his enduring autonomy and intelligence. These actions, while seemingly mundane, demonstrated his capacity to operate within the constraints imposed upon him while retaining control over his own behavior. Observers were forced to acknowledge that his mastery was not only physical but psychological, a combination that made him exceptionally difficult to manage or contain. Buyers and overseers alike were compelled to reconsider the notion of control. Its ownership, they realized, did not guarantee compliance. The man's presence revealed the limitations of traditional methods, challenging the assumptions that had underpinned their authority and forcing a recalibration of strategies for oversight. Each attempt to assert dominance provided insight into his intelligence and adaptability, highlighting the profound gap between the assumptions of authority and the reality of his capability. This dynamic reinforced the idea that he was an extraordinary individual whose influence extended far beyond the immediate physical context. As the days passed, his reputation continued to solidify. Traders and planters shared accounts of his behavior with one another, blending fact and conjecture into narratives that amplified the perception of danger and skill. Even those who had not witnessed his actions firsthand found themselves influenced by the stories, adjusting expectations, behaviors and strategies in anticipation of encounters that might never occur. The social and psychological reach of his reputation became as formidable as his physical abilities, ensuring that the man's impact extended far beyond the confines of the plantation. He maintained a delicate balance between compliance and defiance, demonstrating the skill to operate within imposed boundaries while asserting autonomy in ways that were subtle yet unmistakable. This balance ensured that he remained an enigma, a figure whose capabilities could not be fully anticipated, and whose influence was felt across multiple spheres of interaction. Overseers learned to approach him with respect tempered by caution, while other enslaved individuals navigated proximity with both admiration and vigilance. His strategic awareness and adaptability created a dynamic in which every action, interaction, and observation became significant, reinforcing the perception that he was extraordinary in both intellect and strength. Even in environments designed to suppress autonomy, he found ways to assert control and influence outcomes. His intelligence allowed him to anticipate challenges, exploit weaknesses, and navigate social dynamics with precision. This capability transformed routine tasks into arenas for demonstrating skill, resilience, and strategic thinking. Observers noted that his actions, while often subtle, carried profound implications, reshaping relationships, hierarchies, and expectations within the plantation. The man's presence became a constant factor, shaping the behavior of all who encountered him, and reinforcing the enduring legend that had followed him from auction block to new ownership.
By the time he had settled into the routine of his new ownership, it was clear that he had not relinquished control of his mind, and his continued presence transformed the plantation into a landscape of tension, observation, and silent negotiation. Every individual, enslaved or free, overseer or owner, was acutely aware of his extraordinary abilities, and these perceptions influenced behavior in subtle but profound ways. The man's physical prowess was undeniable, yet it was his intelligence, strategic thinking, and awareness of human behavior that truly distinguished him. People began to understand that he was not simply a laborer to be directed or coerced. He was an agent in his own right, capable of influencing outcomes in ways that transcended conventional notions of control and obedience. His reputation for defiance and danger continued to grow, reinforced by every calculated move he made and every subtle manipulation of his environment. Overseers observed him constantly, noting how he completed tasks efficiently while simultaneously testing limits, exploiting weaknesses, and asserting autonomy without overt confrontation. Even minor deviations in routine were interpreted as signs of strategy, intelligence, and awareness, further amplifying the sense of unpredictability that surrounded him. Those charged with his oversight quickly realized that conventional methods, threats, punishment, and surveillance were insufficient to manage someone of his caliber, and that a new understanding of control, negotiation, and psychological acuity was necessary. Other enslaved individuals on the plantation responded to him with a combination of admiration, caution, and curiosity. They observed his every interaction, noting how he navigated assignments, manipulated attention, and influenced perception. Some attempted to emulate aspects of his strategy, learning to assert subtle forms of autonomy within the constraints imposed upon them. Others maintained careful distance, wary of attracting scrutiny or punishment by association. In this way, he became a central figure, a nexus around which social, behavioral, and psychological dynamics coalesced. His presence reshaped not only the immediate labor environment, but also the broader patterns of interaction and influence within the plantation. Buyers, overseers, and neighbors who had followed the story of his auction and prior exploits understood that owning him carried risks beyond the physical. Psychological influence, the ability to anticipate behavior, and the capacity to manipulate perception were all part of the arsenal he wielded with subtlety and precision. Every action, gesture, and response had potential implications, and observers found themselves continuously adjusting their assumptions and strategies in response. The man's intellect and awareness created an environment in which constant vigilance was necessary, and in which even small miscalculations could have disproportionately large consequences. Stories of minor acts of resistance or cunning circulated rapidly, reinforcing his reputation as untamable and extraordinary. Accounts of subtle manipulations of tasks, deliberate timing in interactions, or the ability to evade direct oversight became part of the mythology surrounding him. These stories, often exaggerated, were repeated across plantations, markets, and social circles, ensuring that his presence and reputation extended far beyond the physical spaces he occupied. Each retelling heightened anticipation, fear, and admiration, and contributed to the enduring perception of him as a man who defied conventional understanding and expectations. The impact of his presence was not limited to individual interactions but extended to the broader social order. Overseers found that his intelligence and strategic thinking forced them to reconsider traditional approaches to control, authority, and supervision. Enslaved individuals learned from his example, developing new strategies for survival and autonomy that reflected his influence. Even the owners, whose initial goal had been to assert dominance through purchase and physical authority, recognized that control was a negotiation rather than a simple imposition. The plantation became a microcosm of constant adaptation, observation, and strategic calculation, with the man at its center as both participant and catalyst. His capacity to manipulate perception was particularly potent. He understood that his reputation, stories of his past defiance, and the aura of unpredictability could be leveraged to influence behavior without overt action. By allowing rumors, gestures, and timing to shape expectations, he created an environment in which others acted cautiously and respectfully, even before any direct engagement. His intelligence transformed psychological influence into a tool of survival and autonomy, demonstrating that power could extend beyond physical domination into the realm of perception and anticipation. Every labor assignment, interaction, and observation became an opportunity to assert control in subtle ways. He approached tasks with meticulous attention, completing them efficiently while occasionally introducing minor deviations that communicated autonomy without inviting confrontation. These small acts, though subtle, demonstrated both awareness and strategy, ensuring that he remained unpredictable and formidable in the eyes of those around him. Overseers and buyers quickly recognized that maintaining authority required constant adaptation, attentiveness, and a negotiation, highlighting the man's extraordinary capacity to influence outcomes within a system designed to suppress autonomy. Word of his ongoing resistance and intelligence traveled quickly, reinforcing his legendary status. Traders, neighbors, and distant planters shared stories, blending fact and embellishment to create an image of a man whose abilities defied conventional comprehension. Each retelling contributed to the perception that he was more than human in certain ways, exceptionally strong, cunning, and aware, and that his influence extended beyond immediate proximity. His legend became a psychological presence, shaping behavior and expectations, even among those who had never interacted with him directly. The dynamic he created transformed the plantation into a complex environment of negotiation, observation, and subtle power struggle. His presence reshaped hierarchies, influenced the behavior of overseers and peers, and challenged conventional assumptions about authority, control, and obedience. The man's intelligence and strategic acumen ensured that he remained a central figure, a source of fascination, fear, and admiration, whose influence was both direct and indirect, tangible and psychological. He was a constant variable, forcing continuous reassessment of expectations, strategies, and interactions. Even within the confines of forced labor, his actions demonstrated remarkable foresight and tactical awareness. He anticipated potential threats, exploited weaknesses in oversight, and subtly manipulated social dynamics to his advantage. These behaviors reinforced the perception of his exceptionalism, and continued to challenge traditional systems of authority. The combination of intellect, awareness, and physical capability made him nearly impossible to predict, and thus nearly impossible to control completely. His influence was pervasive, extending into the behavior, strategies, and expectations of all who interacted with him, and shaping the environment in ways that underscored the limitations of conventional dominance. Over time, his legend solidified, blending lived experience with mythology to create a figure whose reputation would endure long after his immediate circumstances had passed. Stories of defiance, intelligence, and cunning circulated widely, ensuring that his presence would continue to be felt psychologically, socially, and culturally. The man became a symbol of unbroken spirit, exceptional skill, and strategic mastery, demonstrating the profound impact one individual could have on a system designed to suppress autonomy. Each account, retelling, and observation added layers to his reputation, reinforcing the perception that he was extraordinary in ways that extended beyond physical strength to encompass intellect, awareness, and psychological influence. His continued survival and dominance within the plantation highlighted the limits of human control and the resilience of autonomy even in the harshest circumstance. Every calculated action, every subtle assertion of control, and every demonstration of intelligence underscored the reality that ownership did not equal mastery, and that extraordinary individuals could transcend constraints in ways that challenged expectation and authority alike. His presence transformed not only the immediate environment, but the collective consciousness, establishing a legend that would echo far beyond Charleston and endure in memory, reputation, and narrative for generations to come. The man's story did not end with the sale, nor with the chains that bound his body. It persisted in the minds, fears, and whispers of everyone who had encountered him. He became more than a man. He was a force, a living legend, whose very presence reshaped power,
control and perception. Charleston itself seemed to bend around his reputation, as though the city had recognized the anomaly of a human being whose intellect, strength, and defiance could not be confined by ownership or expectation. Every glance, every gesture and every calculated move was a reminder that he remained untamed, a master of strategy, perception and survival in a world determined to suppress him. Even those who sought to dominate him came to understand a painful truth: the extraordinary cannot be subdued through fear or force alone. His intelligence, foresight and subtle manipulation of social dynamics elevated him above ordinary constraints, creating a tension between visibility and unpredictability that rendered him untouchable. Those who had once believed that control could be asserted through purchase or punishment now recognized that real mastery lay not in possession, but in respect, observation and anticipation, and that he had long understood this truth. Stories of his exploits, both real and embellished, spread like wildfire, ensuring that his legend would endure long after his time in Charleston. Traders, overseers, enslaved individuals and curious bystanders alike carried the narratives with them, amplifying the myth, and instilling both admiration and fear wherever they went. The man had transcended the role imposed upon him by society. He had become a symbol of resilience, intelligence and unbroken spirit, a figure who embodied the impossible, the unpredictable and the unconquerable. In the end, the man's greatest power was not in physical dominance alone, nor in any singular act of defiance. It was in the totality of his existence. Every action, every strategic pause and every subtle assertion of autonomy contributed to a legacy that could not be erased, controlled or forgotten. He had transformed the very notion of what it meant to survive under oppression, proving that the human spirit, when coupled with intellect, cunning and resilience, could challenge the strongest systems of domination. Charleston remembered him not simply as a slave, nor as a commodity sold at auction, but as an enigma, a man who defied definition, who outwitted expectation, and who left a mark that would linger in the collective memory of a city and a society built on control. The impossible mystery of his life, the danger he embodied and the audacity of his existence, ensured that his story would echo through history, an enduring testament to the strength, cunning and unyielding spirit of a man who could not be tamed.